How do you start a podcast?
But why are we doing this? What's the reason for all this technological hubbubaloo and so forth? Why would we go to the trouble to connect ourselves via network and record it? What would be the purpose?
Yeah, I think that's a good starting point. That's true. Um, so I mean, I actually wrote this down. Uh, there was a lot of reasons. I think wanted to start a podcast for a long time, but it was more I didn't want to start one by myself and have a bunch of random guests on or anything like that necessarily. I wanted to find somebody that I could like really enjoy talking with, and that was like intellectually like gratifying to me. And so obviously I've been wanting to start a podcast with you, and I've been bugging you for a couple of years. So this is a great excuse for me to talk to you, I think is um, like the first thing. Uh, and then I really wanted an opportunity to talk about what we already talk about, which is sciencey stuff, engineering, philosophy, men's health, veteran trauma, childhood complex trauma, PTSD, um, politics, religion, and everything in between. So, I mean, a podcast. And then I think the third thing I wrote down is I wanted to counter like quasi science bro digital daddy bullshit and certainty out there. Like, um, you and I have talked about this a bunch of times, but this constant overcompensation and overconfidence in stuff that just isn't true, and which is why we've come upon the name of confidently uncertain. I think we want to bring back what it feels like to be uncertain, and hey, it's okay to be uncertain. Like science is about cycles of certainty and uncertainty. So those are three reasons. That's kind of what I wanted to start this. How about you?
Yeah, I think that there's a lot to bring into the public space that gets at the most challenging decades of human life are oftentimes the first decades of our primary differentiation from our families. And we're trying to use whatever the foundation was that we took away from the family experience and then employ that to um, effectively feed ourselves, clothe ourselves, and put ourselves in shelter. And some of us have more or less scaffolding to do that more or less effectively. And when we talk about the the problem of certainty and truth and these maxims to wrap our lives around, there's a lot of noise and chatter in the communication systems that we have access to that just make all that a lot more confusing. And so um, I like the idea of getting into topic areas that address some of these uncertain places, but not to necessarily give someone a skeleton key or a pattern to conform around, but it's more about some of those most general things that we can reflect back on and think about how that worked for us, or maybe even more usefully, how it didn't work for us, how there were things that were just total dead ends. And it's never to say, don't try my dead end thing, just know that in the time that I tried it, it wasn't effective, it didn't work out.
Yeah, I think that really touches to one of the things that probably I would like to avoid too is not preaching at the audience, but like relating with the audience
Mm-hmm.
is I think what you're talking about is relating our experiences, and when you're relating, you're trying to share something that they find similar, right? Or like they had a
Right.
similar experience, or maybe they're on a different stage of whatever the same experience you're going through, right? Or um, opportunities for them to counter with success if we're sharing failures too. Hey, oh, this did work for me. I think that's interesting too. Um, yeah, I think relating. There's, it's funny with this. Well, I guess we should probably introduce ourselves too while we're at it here. So
I mean, sure.
why not? Yeah. And then we can talk more about what we want to talk about all day long. Um, so I'll start. I'm My name is Pierson Gest. Uh, I'm a renewable energy engineer. I graduated a couple of years ago from Oregon Tech, where I met Richard, one of my colleagues, who's also at Oregon Tech. Um, I'm a hydropower designer currently at a major consulting firm, and yeah, love my job. I'm married. I have two kids, and what else is pertinent? I wrote down stuff for me to tell. Um, Yeah, I have two dogs. We live in California in the Bay Area. I'm a veteran from an infantry unit, long range recon surveillance. Um, so I was airborne. I served nearly 6 years. I was medically retired. And before that, I grew up on a cow farm outside of a small logging town in Oregon called Staten. So um, that's a pretty good start. How about you, Rich?
My introduction is going to sound remarkably close to yours because of some of those parallels. You know that there are there are identity pieces in that introduction, which are to say, how do I identify? And I identify as this man who comes from Western Oregon, who joined the Army at 17, who left the Army at 26, and um, was seeking out something that was a solution to all the problems that being a service member presented. And that is my ambivalence about our military actions in the Middle East and my role in those. And so I found myself attending a college that had a degree program that specifically talked about maybe some alternative ways to go about how we were living our lives and obtaining energy. And so one of my other identities is that I'm a public employee at a university, the same one that Pierce went to. That's how we know each other. We didn't meet in the Army, which would have been a lot of fun, but since we were different job specialties or MOSs, we probably also would have had an inter-service rivalry.
Most likely, yeah, yeah.
no,
I,
no infantryman has any time for a cavalryman, and no cavalryman has any time for an infantryman.
Unironically, we were attached to a cavalry unit before we got attached to like command. So we were 338 Cav, and for all they're trying, they tried to put spurs on us every year, and
Yeah,
we told them to go fuck themselves every year.
as well you
Uh,
should have.
yeah, so there probably would have been that, but it would have been good-hearted. It's funny, like all of that MOS shit really kind of goes away after you get out of the army. To a degree, you're just kind of like, it's like army, same team. Even, I mean, military, it's like same team. I mean, we run into more Navy guys than anything else. I feel like at OIT, there's always a bunch of Navy dudes becoming mechanical engineers, it seems. So, uh, yeah,
Yeah, that's the case. Is that the cohort of people who are now called veterans? One of those identities is it's a brand new version of the thing that we were doing before, which is to be, uh, or rather, to exemplify the narcissism of small differences. And
yeah,
so the new narcissism of small differences is, well, the veteran is different from the person who never served,
yeah,
and so now it's a collating uh, identity for us at our
yeah.
at the university, at the campus where Pierce and I interacted. So I'm a student sometimes at that university. Um, we have a veteran service center. We have a kind of our own little clubhouse that we could hang out at, and it's usually pretty. I don't know if I want to call it peaceable, but definitely everyone's on their best behavior because now we have a brand new identity with each other. And when I can I have all the boring stories you can imagine every vet has to, you know, to stealing your time and life force away by telling them. But I went to a leadership school before I left, and I was there with people from all different branches and different types of different areas of the Army who were also there for the leadership training. And of course, I had an inter-service rivalry with the guys that were Apache repair, who
Yeah,
were Apache mechanics and crew chief. We're aviation. There's no difference, and yet it's those narcissism of small differences where just because he worked on a different helicopter, it was fun to rib him.
yeah. I mean, something over here was different, you know.
Yeah,
Like that's
exactly.
all it meant. There's something right here, maybe a little bit something
Yep.
right here is different. If there's this is different, right? These are the when you're in the military too, like these brigades, right? You have the
Mm-hmm.
specialists who what they call the army of specialists. There's a term for it. It's just like, yeah, it's a bunch of angry specialists who weren't getting promoted to sergeant yet. Uh, I've already been out of the military too long to forget all the terms and stuff. So yeah, it's funny. Anyways, yeah, so we both met at OIT, and through series of events, and we became quick friends and colleagues, and had some pretty awesome conversations that led to us, staying in contact after I got out of school, which I thought, that's always a good thing. When you make friends outside of college, I think some of those are like those lasting relationships that, yeah, you don't understand that those are the ones that they tend to have legs through the rest of the time, potentially. Those in your workplace friends, those are about the ones that keep the legs. I keep friends with some of my veteran buddies, but um, I barely talk to anybody from my high school, I have to say. A couple buds, but
Well, as we hurtle around the sun every lap, our brains change a little bit, and the people that we could identify with and create a network around at 15, 17, they our our paths diverged enough and our brains changed enough in the intervening years that it's really not realistic to try to retain a community with them. Not in the modern civilization that we live in. If
yeah,
we were as I take to do to imagine a scenario where we're in a small village in a valley somewhere, of course the people that you were in diapers with and in adolescence with, you're probably also going to have a lifelong relationship with because that community is so much more isolated and small. But this one isn't. We're sort of defined by our mobility.
yeah. Um, and so to build off that, I can say honestly that many of our conversations have probably had some of the most impact on my life from just being able to share my thoughts at the time. I think I'll always harken back to one of our conversations that happened my senior term. It was my senior fall term, and God, it was just such a it was a barn burner. I believe we'd lost so many professors by then. It was COVID was still happening. This was 2021, fall of 2021, going into 2022. So we were still dealing with the aftermath of the pandemic, which had just annihilated the teaching staff at Oregon Tech at the time. Um, and I had specifically, I mean, my HVAC class was just brutal. We had a brand new adjunct professor who didn't really understand what he was doing or teaching, but remembered that that class was really hard and decided that that was going to be the model by which he taught without teaching any of the technical stuff that needed to go into that class, which is the most technical of the three green building classes. Um, and I had just attended a meeting about accreditation, about which courses to cut from the EE/RE program, and calculus was being cut. Like Calc 4 and Calc 3, I believe, was being cut from one of those programs, which was pretty crazy to me, I thought, at least as an engineer. Now, having worked as an engineer for a couple of years, it's like they probably didn't need it. But I mean, for a consultant, they didn't need it potentially, right? If you're working in R&D, that's a different, like a completely different situation. But uh, I was reeling from the aftermath of that meeting. I was pretty emotionally raw, and you had like basically were like, "You have PTSD," and I was like, after we talked for a couple hours, and at the time I was like, "No, I haven't been." Um, I was like, "No, I didn't get deployed, man." I was like, I didn't get blown up. I'm fine. You know, I had some shitty missions. I got injured a lot. I was treated like an infantryman, of course. Um,
Mhm.
but And at the time, I believe you were just getting into the research that what you would have later, I think, corrected and called it like complex childhood trauma, possibly, or something like that along those lines at the
Mhm.
time, which I mean, it's still trauma, what post part, whatever you want to call it, there's all the elements of trauma were there. Um, but at the time, so for me, because I like my mind stuck to PTSD, and I was like, I'm a vet. I was like, nah, I'm not taking that one. But I let that kind of it ruminated in me, and it, there was already a lot of changes in my life over the last couple of years that had been happening. At that point, I had been getting rid of addictions and had a kid and was trying to figure out how to be a real adult, and I had so far kind of dropped the ball from having the kid up until that point. I wasn't doing, I can say now what I do as a father and a husband. I could say that guy was not doing it. He was not getting it done. And anyways, I was going through this transitional period, and something you had said to me really, really stuck. And it grew like an idea. I think, Inception talks about seeds of ideas. It grew into something
Mhm.
until I think I had this breakthrough right when that term ended. I think it gave my brain time to process what you had said internally long enough for me to kind of have this, aha moment where I realized suddenly, holy shit, yeah, I did have a lot of trauma. uh, I quit video games that Christmas break just on my own. I wasn't like I didn't get in a fight, and that had been an insidious addiction that I had carried with me since my teen years. And when I quit that, it was like the last leg of it was like the last card of like this stacked house of cards of addictions. Which, if we're talking to vets, they might have some feelings about House of Cards of addictions and how they stack on each other. This might sound familiar, I would say, especially for the enlisted guys out there. If this is ringing true, it's pretty common, I would say, probably amongst vets. And so that the video game one was like the last big addiction, and it had been taking a lot of space in my brain. Just that addiction in general had really occupied a lot of compute power, a lot of memories, and I'd use that as the main method of escapism when I was a kid. So a lot was
Mhm.
tied to that addiction specifically. And so you were the catalyst for that, that kind of led to that. And then once that happened, I was very raw. My memories started flooding back pretty hard about my childhood and my parents and like interactions with them, and that never stopped. That continued, but that was kind of it was a flood. And I really had a great Christmas break. It sounds like really intense, but it was like I quit video games, and I ended up just spending all the 2 weeks with my son and my wife, and I was cooking, and we were just having a good time, and I wasn't trying to get done with everything in the family to get to the video games, which is always kind of my thing that I would do, is like get everything done. And then, I would be like, oh, put in time. I got better with my video game addiction as far as like, I would be like, put in time with my wife, put in time with my son, but in my head, I had like, if I get good time in with my wife and son, then I owe myself a video game, I would reward myself. It which it just did, that it doesn't work after a while, and it wasn't working. And so once I got rid of that, I was just like, let me hang out with these lovely people that I care about, and enjoy this time. it was a really phenomenal time. I could ramble on all about it, but I that was one of the key breakthroughs where I was like, well, Richard now will always be someone special to my life. And subsequently, over the next 2 years or the next year and a half or whatever, when we would have conversations, I would always have these reflective periods of time. And the only other person I have these with really is with Sarah. So that means you're a very special person to me because I would have these reflective moments where a lot of thoughts that I might not have been able to materialize would all of a sudden all come together, and I would be able to talk concisely about big and broad ideas that maybe I had been ruminating around me. I would come to new big ideas based on our interactions and books and readings that you were sharing with me. Um, and so that was I think that was a really big moment for me. And what kind of led to me wanting to do this podcast and where we are now. And hopefully can kind of give people a window to some of the shit we're going to talk about when it comes to men's health and mental health and all of that, because that was key for me. And I'm going to shut up now because I know during this period you were going through a lot too and doing a ton of studying and aha moments with yourself up until this point. And so I'll let you talk about that because, um,
Yeah, I thank you for that, and I want to reciprocate that. Um, one of the interesting to me, the interesting parts of the um, trauma history and trauma journey I've been through, or trauma recovery journey, was when I realized, or rather learned these new terminologies that would help me sort of navigate that. And one of them is what's called insecure attachment. And so when we talk about what it means to have friendships in adulthood and to be connected to people that we care about or that are meaningful to us in our friendship, the brain that I ended up with to use as an adult was kind of deprived of those drives and um, a drive for and a ability to maintain close relationships. And so I talk about hurtling around the sun. That whole passage through my 20s and 30s was one of isolation, was one of finding more and more isolation. It didn't mean that I was by myself in a cabin in the woods. It just meant that I would interact with people and never make connections with them, and never feel like the connection was was important enough to maintain just because of that attachment concept. And certainly it's one of the things that I'm introducing some ideas and terminologies here when we talk about trauma and trauma recovery that, I'm not a therapist, I'm not a psychologist, I'm not a psychiatric doctor, I'm a lay person entirely, but I've I've really I've really wanted to get at the substrate of what made me so miserable all the time. And I'm one of the background stories here is that in 2020, a marriage that was about 22 years in length ended, and it ended right about the time at the start of the pandemic, and not because of the pandemic, but because that was when the just impossibly thin filaments that made up that marriage began to break, and really break hard. And so um, I want to pause and reciprocate to you, Pierce, that I I absolutely see you as one of my closest friends, because now I can say I have more than one close friend these days. It's actually been a enterprise in my life to develop friendships and maintain them, even though we're at distances away from each other.
yeah,
And
I,
not only that, the the part where you're talking about how I don't think of myself as somebody's Sherpa or mentor in this way, but to say that it's important and meaningful to me to have these enriching conversations where I make contact with other vets and we talk about the things that are hardest for us, and in that build community. Please.
Y yes. And yeah, I mean, there's so much to touch on there, but I completely agree. I mean, one of the things you realize is like with the internet and remote work and all this stuff is like I'm always like, and now with kids, like, will I ever get to live where I want to live, and do I know where I want to live? You know, like that. Those are like some questions that I ask myself.
Mhm.
And then how do you in the modern era, you know, utilize the internet to do what everyone thought it was going to do, which a lot of
Right.
times it isolated people. But everyone thought it was going to bring us together. And so one of the cool things is we get to use the internet to do that here. And in fact, hopefully build a community, like you said, that's larger, that comes from this too, and that finds, if not necessarily expertise on anything in one particular, but, and I wouldn't, at the time you might have been a layman on the psychological journey, maybe 2019, 2020, because you had only been in therapy for a couple of years so far, but after 5 years of therapy, and I would say probably close to doctorate levels worth of reading of material, like if you had, if you overlaid what their reading list had been, I would say there's probably some medical journals that you haven't looked at, but there's a lot of other stuff written by experts, which you know, uh, one quick note I'll say, I forgot, God, I forgot her name. I think Sarah actually said it. Sarah CM Payne said, like, you should read a lot of other stuff, but like there's a reason why experts, like there are experts who write whole books. They read the really hard medical journals and then they disseminate that to laymen like us. I know you've read a lot of that material. And so, you know, and when we're, and so I will, like, the caveat is like, I am not a psychologist either. I'm an engineer. I am not just curious about engineering things, but I am curious about the engineering behind us as humans too. So I think that's my
Yeah.
my little add to that. But yes, we're not psychologists, we're not psychotherapists or anything like that. We can relate, we can talk about our own trauma and trauma of our friends that we've talked to too. I know you and I have both talked to plenty of vets who have all kinds of trauma soups, um,
Right.
that we've talked about, and that's kind of what we'll offer, and which I think is a really valuable insight too, as well. It's just different. And so yeah, building relationships. So one thing I'll say about that, when you said deep friendship, or like you have close friends now, and what these friends, what the purpose is of that friend. So I've been writing a lot lately on that damn book,
Mhm.
and so I'm gonna just jump right into where I am at the book right now to
Mhm.
talk about this today, because I figured, fuck it, why not? And then we can maybe go over some charter stuff throughout the next couple episodes and this one as we go.
Mhm.
But, structure wise.
Mhm.
So one thing about friends and just human to human relationship interface that I think is so important is my overall thesis for, like, my outlook on life is that, what if life is more than just biological, like the biological definition of life, but more generally, a more general system of life? Um, and a life is just a system that has markers that make it that lifelike characteristics, right? There's cycles, there's periodicity, there's growth, there's retraction, there's what is it when you regression? There's regression in life cycles and things like
Yeah.
that. There's destruction in life cycles, and then there's propagation.
Mhm.
This happens in a system, and so my overall theory in general that I've been trying to hone in, and I think it birthed a couple of years ago when I was talking to you, but it's starting to form as things form, is that, what if every system that is life-like, and my life definition is larger, in its ideal state is a sine wave? It's as simple as that. And so I've really been getting into constructive and destructive
Mm.
interference. So because naturally with sine waves, it's very easy to want to think of harmonics, and so I've been having to go back into my instrumentation kind of notes and the annals of that memory right there. um, to talk about constructive interference and imagining like a really strong signal can be the amalgamation of a bunch of other signals that have the same frequency but are just at a different phase, and how those phases can be different with either angle or time delay. There's some common phase change. And so the idea behind friendship, and going back to what you were talking about and how important it is to have close friends and things like that, or just people close to you, is you need healthy attenuation and signal boosting, and you need to be able to cancel noise sometimes, and all these different things that have to do with harmonics. I believe your relationships have a lot to do with that. Your relationship with yourself, your own health, what you're doing, all of these things. And I'm not breaking the bank on newfound thoughts. Like this is, I've met many Indians who could tell you all about different signals and frequencies and things like that. And so, like, I'm not, and Tesla, for the love of God, was onto this 100 years ago. So
Yeah.
I'm right there with that, and so I'm just presenting this idea. We're going to talk about it more at length, and I'm not going to get into it too deep today, but I just wanted to talk about your the part about you talking about close friends, and like it's about it's about giving feedback, like actual verbal feedback, auditorial feedback, and boosting each other's signal and dampening parts that need to be dampened and stuff. That's what these close relationships are, you know. Um, and the destructive ones, they can do all the opposite stuff to a signal too, right? Like your destructive relationships, we know that those can do the opposite thing. So that is all to say, I'm really interested in the science of us as an engineered
Mhm.
device. I think biologists will always fight the idea that we're, engineered, and engineers will probably, will try to push that we are. It's probably somewhere in between. But I just wanted to get that
Well,
out as a thought.
engineering is one of the branches of science that we can use to understand complex phenomena and what could be more complex than ourselves.
Yeah.
That said, there's a way to think about biology, and that is that nature is a tinkerer, not really a designer. And so you'll encounter aspects of our biology and neurobiology and how our brains work that on first pass this doesn't make any sense. Why would this be the result of the process of evolution and right the process of growth? But it turns out that each time an organism changes through time and becomes more complex or diversifies in some way, it's more to do with the um, the exploitation of the place it finds itself in the universe, and whether or not that leads to not just offspring, but secondary generation. So the offspring of offspring, and you don't get design time with that. You get, well, let's try this out, and if it works, it makes it through a bottleneck. That's the tinkering part. And
Yeah.
your observation about the how maybe biologists would push back on the engineering piece. Well, engineering is, again, it's just a way to better get our minds around this surfeit of variables that would be hard to describe and hard to see how they fit together if we try to just identify one and study it in a vacuum.
Yeah. We want to apply science and go, hey, this is how it works. Like I don't
Yeah,
need to know all the theory, but just this is how it works.
right.
No, but yeah, I'm totally with you on that. I think it's funny. Uh, I think about I watched a lecture recently about a guy talking about uh, what the beginnings of life are. Obviously, I was like, oh, this is an interesting thing. And he
Mm-hmm.
was talking about how everyone thought genes are coding proteins and doing all this stuff. And then, like, what you're talking about was
Yeah.
funny is like, I just heard echoes of like genes don't do shit. It's like all these exogenous like effects actually cause the genes to do something. So like, oh, you do this to a gene, now it does something. Now like it's a reactor. It reacts uh to exogenous effects. And then they were like, well, RNA, that's got to be the thing that does it now. And I think it was going through the list, and then at this point they've come up with like, hey, the way these, there's all these proteins that just kind of like have a bunch of like broad use until like a specific um like the cell or whatever is like, oh, what we need the protein to do this. It's a hand cell now or whatever. Um and I just thought, oh, so now it's a collective, like collectively the cell with all this different cities and villages inside of it. Because if you look at one of those things, if anybody pulls up a cell right
Mhm.
now, like a digital, like the most recent digitally photographed cell, it's like something from a sci-fi movie. It's a whole city of all kinds of chaos happening there. But collectively, that cell makes decisions, it votes, and it says that protein is this or whatever. And I'm totally minimizing it and probably misexplaining it, but um, I think I find that fun and interesting when it comes to the idea of, you know, how an engineer looks at it necessarily, and I'm just one engineer. Other engineers are going to look at it differently, obviously. Um, so yeah, that's uh, it's interesting.
Probably, um, I had a couple different ideas here that kind of came to mind, but we'll probably get into some of the um, axioms that help. I use axioms to help me have a baseline from which to approach questions or problems. And
Yeah,
these axioms need they need not be so rigid that they can't be edited, but what they do is they provide sort of a abstract understanding of how to approach when we are curious about something, and going to come up a lot, the idea of curiosity.
yeah.
So one of the axioms that I like to go back to is that nothing in nature lives in a vacuum. It's surrounded by other things, which are all a, I'll use this term, potentiation. They, the, the surroundings that any biological substance is immersed in potentiate, causes potentiation, either amplification or attenuation. And in biological systems, you can think about any part of a biological system as just being a collection of potentials. Some of them are lower, some of them are higher. And yeah, it sounds like a lot of noise, but what ultimately happens in biological systems is that that noise is the genius of how things live and propagate and are successful. It's because there isn't just one rigid recipe for how they come into existence and how they grow and how they mature and pass through a life cycle. And
Chaos is built into these
ultimately,
systems. Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't.
exactly.
Yeah, um, even at the
But that's
cellular
a
level,
great way
it's
to
like,
it's a great way to think about it. But also, not only that, it's uh, at the risk of just dragging the whole conversation all the way to the floor. It's in physics, we think about these scenarios that are aggregations of um, it's statistical basically, and that's what quantum physics is. It's the statistical like probability that a particle will be present or not.
yeah,
And so there's a concept called quantum biology, and so quantum biology is the kind of the fuzzy way of looking at whether or not a biological component, whether it be at the protein level, I mean, down to the molecular level, down to the atomic level, down to the subatomic level, it is the fuzziness of all those pieces fitting together. And a true theme that will go through everything that we talk about, at least everything that I contribute to, is the idea that nothing's in a vacuum. It is surrounded by other things that are giving it potential or attenuating its potential. and that relationships are the fundamental aspect of life. That life without relationships is really not much of a life at all. But everyone thinks of relationships differently. And when I say relationships, I'm literally referring to the relationships that are defined by members of a species, the relationships that the species has outside of its species, and the
The
relationships
spectrum
that
of
those
relationships.
species all have that form a network and a biological network. So
Yeah,
yeah, it's easy to get into the tall weeds and kind of have overwhelming ideas when we get into the topic of life and biology, but really that the axiom comes back to inform that.
yeah, I think that's well put, and also it's funny when you say that, like a lot of it's just potentiality.
Mm-hmm.
I would say, you know, that could be expanded to the universe seems to be,
Mm-hmm.
you know, a system that has a lot of potential and some various building block mechanisms, forces, um, and rules that allow that potentiality to play out, right? And like that seems to be you know, the system of our universe, you know, and we will get into that because this is one of my topics that I love to talk about is, you know, planet accretion and how, you know, supermassive stars are formed, and then eventually how they explode and create nebulas of all kinds of atomic matter and subatomic matter most likely, and then how that creates planets and life, and you know just the whole cycle. I think this is some of the most fascinating stuff, and it'll be fun because you're really looking at it from the life side or the biological level a lot of times, and from your angle. So it'll be cool to see how these systems overlap and the similarities, and then the difference of the systems. Um, so yeah, great axiom. We can talk about a couple more of those actually while we're at it. I believe
Yeah,
that
one
would
of
be section two is what you just touched on. No,
yeah, a little bit.
not quite. A little bit.
If you
I
have the
do.
axiom document up, uh, let's see if I'm going to try to do this from memory. I'm probably going to mess it up because I don't have it in front of me right now. I have multiple screens I could have set up today, but that didn't work out before we got recording. So I'll
That's
try to have
okay.
that next
Re
time.
recording one. It's gonna
Yeah.
be like
So
this.
yeah, totally. So some of the axioms that I I I work with are one. We talk about periodicity. That there is no flat signal in the nature that we came to be in. And that is exemplified by our circuit around the sun and the circuit of the sun in its path around the galaxy. And we could see larger and larger, more macro cycles. And then there are cycles that are a part of solar that solar interaction. And so whenever however we want to try to learn something about ourselves or something about the natural system that we exist in, we have to accept that there are periodic components of that, or as you said, sine waves. It's the oscillation between light and dark that makes up our day, the oscillation between warm and cold that makes up our year. It's the oscillation that we have in the form of uh, biological horizons, such as metabolic and reproductive. And
Our learning cycle
there's
is periodic. The way we learn
absolutely.
things, you go through a peak where your initial like there's that like the part where you easily grasp some of the initial concepts to learning something,
Hmm.
then you hit like a frustration plateau and then like regression because you're frustrated, maybe you
Yeah.
stop trying to learn that thing a little bit or focus on something else, and then, you know, you push through this part of the sine wave of the learning process and then back onto the next one. So yeah, you know, uh, I yeah, cyclicality and periodicity. Everything is spinning. Our planet is spinning. Our sun is spinning. We're spinning around it. The sun is going around our like a bullet around our galaxy. Our galaxy is spinning. And you know, our universe, you know, is just full of spinning objects. Um, just naturally you're going to have something that spins, you're going to have periodicity. Just it's the
And built
nature of the
into
beast.
periodicity is the meta concept of potentiality, which is to say that because of the way periods work, there's going to be a high side of the sine wave and a low side of the sine wave. And sometimes, with regard to people's mood and how their countenance is throughout the year, sometimes we're just completely capable of going into the kitchen and cleaning the place up. And other times, it's just going to be impossible. And so the expectation that we're always going to be on and to always be able to deliver at one signal strength is really not realistic. And it's one of the ideas that we're gonna express with our conversations, which is as as we get into these ideas of health and aging and mental health, yeah, to as soon as you can to shed the idea that you can be just one signal strength, that's going to go a long way to help you out.
No, yeah, just knowing and then therefore acting based on this. One thing I feel like, God, we could really get into the weeds on that one right away. I'll say one thing I think about that is like not necessarily how do I stop the down cycle of my sine waves, right? And
Yeah.
understand that that is actually like a necessary period of my growth. Like if I think
Yep.
of any of the cycles within my own life. And so then how do I embrace and learn the most from what this portion, whatever you apply this portion to your life will be? How do I learn from that and not dismiss it or try to get rid of the negative, right? I think so many times we think of like negative, the term negative, negative connotations, and so on. Um, so I think that that's a way I look at uh, the down cycle, and things like that. So, and we'll definitely dive into this because um, I have I've gone from, I think I always explain things like, oh, top right quadrant, you have a ramp function with a sine wave going through it forever. And that's
Mm-hmm.
what you're trying to boost your own signal eventually to. But you can't ignore the other three quadrants. And most likely, and so of course you could see where, my book started to get really hairy is when you go, well, there's three other quadrants and you start mapping sine waves that in all of those directions, and then you're like, well, how do I get this one to go that way without all these ones like canceling each other out? How do I measure these two? And then the next thing you start to go is like, well, is it a Cartesian plane, or is the y-axis actually the z-axis, and is this ramp function actually going around the z-axis, and is there a sine wave going over it? And then things get really crazy. So that leads me into saying one of the things that I mentioned this morning and that I have thought about is that I do want to use this podcast as an opportunity to bring in intellectuals like a fly trap to watch our shit. So, I mean, I think we have to have some fairly compelling science talk, engineering, and nerd corner stuff because I would like mathematicians and physicists to watch what we are producing, and for purely selfish motivations because I have math problems I do not have the capability to perform. I have physics problems that I don't have the skill to go into, and I would love audience participation eventually, where people are like, hey, I would like to take a stab at this part of your math problem that you've laid out. So I would say if it was a movie, it would be like, I'd love to have my Goodwill Hunting moments, but not me being Goodwill Hunting, where I put this shit out and, our lovely genius janitors who are watching this podcast can write in their answers if that makes any sense. So, I thought that would be worth mentioning, though.
Yeah. So I pulled up my I think this is what I contributed to our foundational documents, and for the purpose of letting the audience know what we're talking about, one of the first things that Pierson and I began to do when we started talking about doing this program was to conceptualize where what it meant to have a resolved perspective, what it means to, just because two people come together as friends doesn't mean that they both have to have one idea about everything. They probably should have a little bit of diversity. But if we do have ideas that are similar, what does that look like? How could those be described? And so I began doing some writing, and I came up with these axioms. And I believe I wrote it out something like the first part of it is statistics. That
Yeah.
when we're going to get into topics that are divisive on the internet. There are people who are either taken in by pseudoscience or by ideas that fit their narrative, but their narrative is kind of cloistered or doesn't have
Mm-hmm.
a lot of access to ways to think about situations that are critical. And we expect to hear feedback to our conversations that proposes counterfactuals or ideas that are in contrast. And so one of the first things that we would like to consider when we talk about how things are for us is statistics. I mentioned quantum earlier. So quantum being this idea of there being a statistical probability of a particle being in a location when we're studying it in physics. So
Yeah.
statistics, if you have larger data sets, you can develop clearer trend lines. So that means that if something is true for Pierson and I, it may not be true at all for any of the rest of the vets out there, or any of the other people from the part of Oregon that we're from, or students in a baccalaureate program. It might be totally different for them. In fact, we went to college as adults. So the experiences that we're having in college, for example, are going to be different from those who are people who are 18, 19, 20. So larger
And they
data
were.
sets provide clearer trend lines.
Yeah.
Yeah, totally. Uh,
Yeah.
small,
That's
da-
so true. Yeah. Anyways.
small data sets are usually anecdotes and are best applied at dinner party conversation, not the basis for policy. The
Yeah.
kind of the two ways to look at when we're talking about something being statistically relevant. I mean,
Yeah. And then there's the
that's
coffee
what.
studies, right? There's the coffee
Yeah,
studies, which you see every year, right? That this coffee is killing you every year, or it's saving you from some disease, and there will be coffee studies every year, and those will fall somewhere in there. I think we'll put some level of asterisks on those types of studies as well, right? Because I don't know if they're
yeah,
like, I don't want to say that they fall under the small sample size of statistics, but they seem like I would put a caveat next to those because um, they wouldn't be sure science, right? Because it's like an ongoing, the stuff that we wish wash on and everything like that. Um, so yeah, go.
there's this idea about the bleeding edge of science is always going to have a larger degree of uncertainty, and when the lay public encounters a scientific idea or maybe a sort of a news story about a scientific idea, you're absolutely right. So the three things are coffee is either healthy or unhealthy, red wine is either healthy or unhealthy, and eggs are either healthy or unhealthy, and no one ever resolves that into a sure outcome. And
That's
so
why
what
I eat them all and drink it.
exactly we consume it all, so it all cancels out, right? It's
Yeah.
a tripling effect of cancellation, and
Yeah.
and that has a lot to do with how the public can be frustrated with scientists and with science literature and science communication, because just please tell me the thing to do so I can just do that, and it seems to oscillate all the time. And we would like to let the public know as we're talking about these things that if we're talking about the bleeding edge of science, it's probably going to be different in 18 months just because some new publication comes out. And not because it was tested properly, not because it was peer reviewed properly, but because someone reported on it before it had all of that validation. And so with scientific terms, if we're looking at a data set that's, six people, or it's not double blinded, or the data set has all these other um, in, let's see. Yes, the word would be impeachable. All of these impeachable qualities, then it's less science and it's more an anecdote. And anecdotes
And
are fine. They're just better for dinner parties.
sure, and I will add to this because to the best of our ability, I can say we will try to look at those issues and also the location of the source, like a single
Hmm.
source, like where did this come from? Is it a think group? Is it a think tank? And who is the think tank funded by? Like, we'll look at these
Right.
things because, like, when there's a large data set or multiple data sets or multiple studies, then you don't have to necessarily worry about the individual source so much. But if we're talking about these like dinner party sort, type of statistics, then we need to be really clear where we're getting that sourced information. And as we work out the kinks within this podcast, we'll be Googling during the podcast while you guys are there. So you can all watch where we go, look at what we do, and we'll try to provide the links on the upload as we go. I think this will be something we get better at as we go. Of course, working through the logistics of recording this thing and screen share and so on and so forth. But this does seem to be our hope that intellectual integrity or honesty when we're searching for information, and we will be doing that a lot. Uh, I don't know if we clearly say this in our axioms, but I think it's worth saying that we we did discuss before we started this podcast possible terms or at least some type of way of backing out of a conversation if we don't know what the fuck we're talking about. So
Yeah.
one of the big things for us that I know we will do is and it might annoy people when they're watching if we're really jiving in a conversation but we don't know what we're talking about and I'm starting to like really grasp. um we might just go, hey, we're gonna stop here, circle back after some research, like I need to look into this. Or if it's something mundane or small, we'll just do it online. But I'm gonna just say we reserve the right to cut off the conversation in the middle and button hook to something else if we are in the weeds and talking completely out of our depth. Um, because I know it happens. I mean, shit, our conversations are gonna go all over the place, so we will be out of our depth. Um, I'll probably always make it clear if I know what I'm actually talking about from a professional technical level as a hydropower designer.
Hmm.
I will put a little, I'll be like, hey, this is my wheelhouse. We're talking about batteries, battery management systems. We're talking about like, uh, interconnects for solar and battery systems, or we're talking about, a 100 megawatt hydropower unit. Yeah, I'll be able to talk about those things with some level of and not even like a level of expertise. I like some level of knowledge at this point. I don't even know if I'll be able to claim any engineering expertise yet at my level as engineer, but it'll be more than my non-engineering knowledge, I'll say for now. So I just want to put that big caveat there as um, some thoughts about that.
There's a corollary to that. We reserve the right to change our mind if we have new information. So
Yes.
all the time, there's these circumstances where we can look at a situation, we take what we observe or can read about or whatever, we can whatever information we have to make a decision, make that decision, and then sometimes almost immediately and sometimes maybe months down the road, new information will come in that completely changes that perspective. It just has to. And we reserve the right to be flexible within the context of how changing information changes our idea or our opinion.
Yes.
It would be
It's
intellectually dishonest to be too rigid around these ideas because the philosophy that we want to uphold and participate in is in the conversation that is the scientific process. To form an idea, test an idea with new information, change the idea, and then test it again. And that's what we're going to demonstrate that in our conversations. We're going to demonstrate that in our um, topics that we want to discuss. And this is the reason why it's a good idea for us to, and I'm sure that we'll either talk about the written ideas behind what we're doing here, that's such as my axioms, or we'll publish them in some cases because we'll want people to know. So the baseline of where we're coming from is here's this abstract idea, and this abstract idea works for a wide range of implications and implementations. I try to combine those two words.
Yeah, implicate. Yeah, I can't pull it off. I was like, let me give that a never mind. Um, yeah, I I think that's fundamental to what we're going to be doing with our chats is we totally reserve the right to change our mind about something and to reevaluate, um, to go back in what we say. I think and we're coming up on an hour here, so that's pretty. I think we're almost done with this first recording here on
Mhm.
confidently uncertain, which we didn't name drop the name of our podcast, the XY Chromies confidently uncertain, but I'm dropping it now because it's our first recording.
Mhm.
So oh well. Um, you know, I on the reserving the right to change your mind. I think one of the biggest misnomers that's been a product of the human condition for a long time has been that like follow the person that thinks they know everything, like that person who's confident about
Yeah.
everything, or as we like to call it, the people who are confidently incorrect all the time, or they're so certain of everything, even outside of their depth, and there's plenty of online figures. I'm sure anybody who listens to our podcast will know who we're talking about, and we'll go into the weeds with each of these people most likely at some point. Uh, they'll pop up in the criticism at some point because just there'll be overlap in subject material. But I, that has been one of the biggest pet peeves for me is watching these people, and they garner a huge audience, and uh, they're off there just saying a bunch of bullcrap. Anyways, I digress from my main point. The point is people are looking for that, um, because I guess that reassures them. But I think it would be great if we could open them up to people being that uncertainty is actually not a bad thing. Like uncertainty is kind of where you are in a lot of issues within your life, no matter what, because you can't predict the future. At the end of the day, we only have our large sample sizes and our statistics to guide us when we make decisions generally, right? And anybody could tell you there's statistics and there's flat out lies. Do you fall in the statistical norm? And how often have you fallen out of the statistical norm? So, it doesn't help anybody that no one has the right answers. And I think what we want to relay is that it's okay that no one has the right answers. In fact, that's part of the fun of life. Like that's just part of it. Or, I think Nietzsche, not Nietzsche, Dostoevsky. I'm going to totally jack his name up, but he said, you can't be mad at the bad things that happen to you in life, or the hard things that happen to you in life, or the tragedy, because that is part of life too. So to be mad at that, you're mad at life itself. And so uncertainty is part of life. And I think that this podcast is going to embrace that part and explore that uncertainty together and maybe we'll learn something and have good conversations. So those are like my
Yeah.
closing words.
And I'll hopefully bookend that with this idea that I could probably attribute to Pima Chodron, but that's you know life is not about getting perfect at balancing on that ball that we're standing on. It's about being okay with being out of balance all the time. It's about developing the wisdom and skill around coming back to the idea of obtaining that balance, but being completely okay with never actually attaining it. And so there will be questions that when when Pierce and I shuffle off our mortar coils, we've never actually come to a conclusion on, and that's going to be fine. And part of the part of the joy of the next 40 years that I get on the planet will be in the curiosity around maybe answering some of those questions or maybe never answering them.
Yeah, I completely agree. So Anyways, I'm Pierson Gest. This is Richard Ellis. This is the XY Chromies. We're confidently uncertain. Uh, Hopefully, you guys were able to make through this first recording all right. And we look forward to doing this, putting one of these out every week if we can. So, hello, world.
We'll talk to you next time.
All right. Bye.